Hello, my name is Richard Grannon. In this series, we're going to be looking at the roots of human empathy and what happens when empathy becomes erased. Humanity is usually associated with a certain level of compassion, and when compassion disappears, what you're left with is something far crueler. In this series, we'll be looking at the reptilian complex and how that part of the brain, which in our evolution was not so empathic, can be more in use in some people than in others. We're also going to be looking at how psychopathic, narcissistic personality types might be being dominated by the R complex and the kind of world that they naturally create when they become obsessed with a dominance hierarchy and lose sight of empathy and humanity.
All we want is loving, searching for things unspoken. We can't hold this token.
Hello and welcome. This is episode 1 of the R complex, and today we're going to be looking at a model of the brain called the Triune brain. This was formulated by a gentleman called McLean in the 1960s, in which he hypothesized that there was 3 separate parts of the brain that had evolved separately and had different functions. The reptilian side of the brain, the R complex, was predominantly there for social dominance hierarchies, fight or flight, and a very primal way of looking at the world. You then had the more mammalian end of the spectrum, that part of the brain which would be responsible for bonding and empathy and compassion, and then you had parts of the brain that would be considered more evolved, more human, more related to higher order thinking and analysis. What we'll be exploring in this series is the way in which there seems to be a situation, possibly an evolutionary issue, where some humans are stuck in a different mode of interacting in the world, a mode of interaction that is non-compassionate, that is only focused on dominance hierarchies, that is obsessed with power and the effect on the world for us. If it is the case that narcissistic personality types and psychopathic personality types are actually reflecting a different evolutionary status, then the question becomes, how do we best deal with that? If people who are less evolved than the rest of humanity end up being the ones who rule humanity, things are out of balance, and we need to do something about that. One of the things that I've noticed that is a problem is that humans who are, well, more evolved and more human, more in their empathy, more concerned with coordination, more concerned with we than with me, tend to not be the ones who want to bully and push themselves and cajole and be combative to get to the front of the queue to want to rule everybody else. So that means the best of us, the more empathic, the more thoughtful, tend to sit back, tend to be more patient, tend to be more thoughtful, whilst the more reptilian inclined amongst us scrabble directly and aggressively forward towards power, knocking everybody out of the way that might stop them, and then they seize power for themselves. That leaves the rest of us at a bit of a disadvantage. We're always waiting to see what happens next, whilst they're simply blindly surging forward for power, with no concern, by the way, as to whether they're actually right for the role. The R complex dominated personality, the narcissistic psychopathic personality, the archontic archetype, this lord, dark lord archetype that's manifested in some of these personalities, do not care for 1 second how qualified they are for the job. They don't care for 1 second whether they would actually be doing the best for everybody else if they get that role. The only thing that they care about is power.
And
you would ask them, do you,
oh, yeah.
do you hate me? Who would you ask that to?
That's one reason I work well with Republicans. I didn't care what they said.
One good way of understanding the narcissistic personality, because the narcissistic and the psychopathic personality is very confusing for normal humans. People who are in touch with their empathy, are in touch with compassion, see themselves as part of an ecosystem, find it bewildering when they're dealing with somebody who is rigidly obsessed with their own power and pushing themselves forward.
Oh yeah.
One good way of understanding this is to think of them almost as coming from a different planet. Their modes of thought and their modes of interaction are so alien, we may as well just jump and make the conclusion, for the purpose of a thought experiment and for the purpose of understanding them, as being alien. In my work, what I've been predominantly doing for the last 8 years is helping people navigate this strange alien terrain of narcissists and psychopaths and people who seem to be terminally, rigidly stuck inside of the reptilian complex part of their brain. If you think of them as being from another planet, a very rough planet, a very rough terrain in very, very harsh conditions, where the only thing they map for is power dynamics, it helps us to understand the strange things that they do when they're operating inside of the world. The strange, cold decisions that they make. This amazing ability they have to throw any kind of moral boundary to the wind just to get done what it is that they want to do. Think of them as alien. Think of them as coming from a harsh planet. We'll call it planet Narcon. And in that environment that's extremely harsh, it's extremely dangerous, the only thing they're evolved to see in the terrain is power dynamics and power hierarchies. Do you remember the film Predator? The Predator comes to Earth and he has one purpose, and that is to hunt for humans. And in the 1980s film, they used their amazing CGI graphics to show how the Predator could only map for heat. The only thing that the Predator could see in the environment when he was hunting for live mammals was the heat of their bodies. In a similar way, you can imagine that they also, the Narcons, the narcotic reptilian types, they also are operating from a very limited visual spectrum, but the heat map that they operate from is power, attention, and power dynamics. The only thing they're interested in is dominance hierarchies and clambering to the top. In this series, we're going to be exploring people who are stuck in a certain part of the brain. In an evolutionary sense, the brain evolved in this model in 3 separate periods and in 3 separate ways. This is called the Triune theory of the brain. There is an old part of the brain called the R complex, the reptilian complex. That part of the brain is responsible for ritual, for obsessive compulsion, for being rigidly attached to dominance hierarchies, to the fight or flight response, to a very primitive struggle for survival. It's not a thinking part of the brain, it's not a compassionate or cooperative part of the brain, it's a brain that's hardwired for survival, aggression, and dominance displays. What this would mean for people who are trying to understand the state of the world that we're in would be that there are actual different parts of the brain that are being accessed, and that there's an evolutionary element to this. There may even be a species element to this, where if you look in the world and you think some people seem to be from a different planet and some people seem to be operating at a different level of consciousness, we can take that as being something that is actually happening. Metaphorically speaking, it's a useful way of looking at the world because they're so different to humans that they're effectively alien. They're so non-empathic that they are effectively almost like a different species. It's a mistake to treat somebody who's in a narcotic reptilian mindset as though they were human. That's how you get hurt. Because if you treat them as though they're coming from the empathic, compassionate, coordinated, cooperative parts of the brain, then you'll start to project your expectation of moral boundaries onto them. You'll project your expectations of morality and a moral value system onto them. And you'll think, oh, I won't worry too much because there's certain things I know that they won't do. Well, ask anybody who's had the misfortune of being married to a narcissistic psychopath or being in a relationship with a narcissistic psychopath, and the one thing that they'll tell you is it's a truly shocking and traumatic experience to see time and again how little moral boundaries these people have. As above, so below, as in the micro, so in the macro. So if you imagine a relationship between a narcissistic a psychopathic human being and their partner, they slowly erode their partner's boundaries down in order to get them to submit because they're obsessed with power. So it is where you have people in positions of power at the highest levels of government and those institutions that operate behind government, what they'll do is they'll target their population as though they were the target of a narcissistically abusive relationship. They will lie to that person. They will gaslight that person or peoples. They will break down their moral boundaries. They'll actually start to invert their values. Why? To create as much confusion as possible. So what they'll actually deliberately do is they'll take somebody else's moral compass. They'll say, well, I believe in truth, I believe in virtue, I believe in honor, I believe in whatever it is, I believe in compassion. And slowly over time, they'll twist those values in the individual so that their values become inverted, so that the person's actually so damaged, their moral system becomes corrupted and they cease to operate from a moral framework. Some people can actually become quite dark through their contact with a narcissistically psychopathic relationship and can develop new values, junk values, unvalues. Sometimes even narcissism itself can become internalized as a value. You'll see the person become more vain, they'll become more grandiose, they'll become more narcissistic, they'll become more aggressive, psychopathic, individualistic. They'll not be seeking to cooperate. They'll care less about the people to the left and right of them. And all that they start to care about, this is the target, by the way, is me, me, me. So as you would see that in an individual relationship between a narcissistic psychopath and their target, I believe we're seeing that now between the people who are in control and the people who are beneath them, the target population. So what we've seen covered elsewhere is the idea that the people who are in control, the people who really are running things, the people who are really running things, not the puppets, not the scapegoats, who are just the front men for it. If they get assassinated, they get caught doing something they shouldn't.
He's a lot of fun to be with. It's even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side.
They go, somebody else comes in. That's not who is actually in control. The people who are really in control are coming from a deeply reptilian part of the brain that takes power for its own sake. It's a power worship cult. So when I get somebody who comes to me and they say, oh, I was in a relationship with a narcissistic psychopathic person, I'm so confused and I still don't understand why they did the things that they did, I'll always say to them, well, there's only one thing to look at, which is a concept called narcissistic supply. The narcissistic psychopathic personality needs supply. They need attention, they need adulation, and they need power.
Has a grandiose sense of self-importance, exaggerates achievements.
I've done more in 500 days than any president has ever done in their first 500 days.
Number 2 is preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, etc.
I'm smarter than they are. I'm richer than they are.
3 believes that he or she is special and unique.
Let me tell you, the one that matters is me. I'm the only one that matters.
4 requires excessive admiration.
I got a standing ovation. In fact, they said it was the biggest standing ovation since Peyton Manning had won the Super Bowl, and they said it was equal.
And they need submission, and they need fear when we're talking about a narcissistic psychopath particularly. That's what they need in order to function. So everything they do is about gaining narcissistic supply, as I've just defined. So similarly, when we're talking about the archontic reptilian archetypes at the top of society, whether they be hidden or whether they be visible, what's their purpose? They're all about gaining their version of narcissistic supply, which is submission, it's power, it's fear from the populace that they're dominating, and control. Whatever leads to them being given more and more control, that's the supply they're addicted to. So we have these archetypal mythological images of the vampires. What do they do in order to survive? They get invited into people's houses, they use charm, they use trickery, they use deception, and they find a way to get the target to invite them in. They seduce. They're usually not aggressive, because if somebody's aggressive with you, you can be aggressive back. If your government or the powers that be are aggressive with you, you can resist aggression. It's not very effective because you actually make the target population fight back. The more aggressively you try and control them, the more you're inviting them to fight back. That's a mammalian response It's not a reptilian response. A mammalian response is, I push you, you push back. I poke you, you fight back. You don't want to do that. It's not very smart. The reptilian way of getting it done is through seduction. It's through the use of words. So notice where you see a person, the micro, or people, the macro, relying on words more than actions. Words more than actions. Words more than actions is an indication of narcissistic psychopathy, the archontic archetype, and coming from the reptilian space in the brain. Why? Because it's easy to lie. What's another archetypal myth that we have? Satan, the snake in the Garden of Eden. How did he do his damage? How did the snake, the first most primal reptile, which is, a snake is nothing more than a brain and a spine. A brain, a spine, and a mouth, and some fangs, and some poison. That's it. How did he get his work done? He whispered and he spoke lies. He's like the first propaganda merchant. He's the first politician. He's the first PR agent that ever existed. He's the media. He's whispering lies. It's words, because with words, you can misrepresent reality. You can't with actions. You can't. When you move into the world of words, that's when you get lost. When you move into the world of narrative, I can spin any narrative I like. I could take the books on this desk now and I could tell you a fascinating story about a thing that you would be fascinated by. I could cast a spell over you. I could, what is it called? It's a glamour. When we talk about celebrities being glamorous, that comes from an old world glamour, which is a spell. If I cast a glamour over you, it's a spell. What is spelling? Spelling is the creation of words. It's all words and it's all magic and it's all, usually it is possible to be misused as a way of binding people in enslaving narrative. Words can also be used for good. We can tell stories that free people. We can write books that show people there's a reality beyond this reality that frees them. We can write books and tell narratives that show us what we probably already know at the deepest levels of our unconscious but hasn't come out yet. So these people will use words. The more you go into words, the more you go into narrative, the easier it is to be confused. So if you want to confuse the populace, what you do is you flood it with words. You flood the population with narratives that conflict. So now we're living in a time with multiple conflicting narratives that fight against each other, that we're all supposed to hold to be true at the same time if you don't want to be seen as a bad person, if you don't want to be deplatformed, if you don't want to be on the receiving end of social shaming. You're supposed to hold fundamentally deceptive, conflicting narratives together. What does that do to you as a human being? It humiliates you. If I force you to present me with something that you know very well is a lie, and I force you to do it publicly, you'll be ashamed, you'll be humiliated, and you'll go into submission. What do these narcotic reptilian types, the narcissistic psychopaths, want? Submission. If they can get your submission, then they get their narcissistic supply, which is power. The only thing they're focused on is power. The power to do what? No, you're being human. You're being reasonable. You're using the more human parts of the brain. You're saying, well, if you want power, it's to do something. That's a human projection. This is power. Why? Because power. Power. Why? Because power. Nothing else. Submission. Why? What for? Because submission. I want the people to worship me. I want them to kneel at my feet, because in the core of my being, I feel that's the natural order. And when I see them have their own individual thoughts, and when they resist me and the wonder that is me, I fly into a violent rage and I want to hurt them. This is called narcissistic injury. When you say no to a narcissist, no to somebody stuck in the R complex, their response will be aggression. Because in their worldview, as I said before, they're mapping in a very primal way, a very infantile way. It's like pre-toddler mapping. It's like, no, this is mine. The world is mine. And you say, well, actually, there's other people in the world, and it's not. No! And then there's regression that you'll receive. But they've learned over the generations, they've learned over the centuries, that when you aggress against people openly, then you encourage open revolt because you give them something to fight. The better way is the way of the snake, is to whisper in their ears and give them ideas that are corrupting and make them feel like those ideas were theirs. That's inception. You put the idea into the population, make it feel like it's their idea. They're humiliated by holding the idea, and then they go into shame, and then they won't fight for themselves because they feel dirty, they feel wrong, they feel like they're doing something that's not right, and then they'll submit. And then they do the smart thing to do is to get the slaves to do the policing and the enslavement themselves. It's hard work trying to police and control slaves. I don't want to do that. I want to get these slaves to learn that the right way to be in the world is to police themselves and to police each other. And that is the state of the world we have right now. It is purely coming from a narcotic reptilian complex. These are narcissistic psychopaths. Their purpose is to create a world in which there is no more horizontal relationships. Horizontal relationships will be finished. If you're interested in psychoanalysis, there was a colleague, not a student, a colleague of Freud called Alfred Adler. And he said, there's a few things that we need to come back to if we want to keep moving forward and evolving as a society. One was community, and the other thing was the recreation of horizontal relationships. He said it's so common now to see relationships go vertical. A horizontal relationship means I'm talking to you across a horizontal plane. I am a human, you are a human. This is my idea, let's hear your idea. Your idea has as much value as my idea. Your body, your brain has as much value as my body and brain. That's horizontal. When we go vertical, I'm in charge, you listen. Your ideas do not have the same value as my ideas. My body, my brain has more value than your body and brain. It becomes vertical. And the more we're operating from this vertical modality, the more we are effectively mirroring the behavior of our archontic masters. Because that's how they see the world. And we go, well, this is the way mummy and daddy act, so that's what I'm going to do too. And what do? We start enslaving other people. We start acting in ways that lead us towards racism, disparity, violence between peoples, and genocide, which they love, of course. Because once we're being violent and aggressive with each other and hating each other for the most puerile, minor, stupid differences that you could possibly imagine, like the amount of melanin in somebody's skin, which I can't even believe we're still at that place in evolution. Surely the aliens watching us must be palm striking themselves in the forehead going, what's wrong with these guys? If they can keep us doing that, it humiliates us because it appeals to the worst in our nature.
6 is exploitative of others, takes advantage of others to achieve his own ends.
Last fall, I pled guilty in federal court to felonies for the benefit of, at the direction of, and in coordination with individual number 1. And for the record, individual number 1 is President Donald J. Trump.
Number 7 lacks empathy, is unwilling to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others. Number 8 is often envious of others or believes others are envious of him.
I'm a little jealous. Are you giving him all the credit? That means the end of his job,
And finally, number 9 regularly shows arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes.
I'm a very stable genius.
I am a stable genius.
Putin did call me a genius.
People would say I'm the super genius of all time. The super genius of all time.
Even though we might not be narcissistic psychopaths, we might not be coming from the reptilian brain, we have the reptilian complex, the R complex inside of us. So what's a smart thing for them to do? It's to inflame it. It's to switch it on. It's to provoke it. It's to trigger us, and we're being triggered all the time. The strong, crazy amongst us, the eccentrics amongst us can say no. But you do go crazy, you do become eccentric, because if you're the only one in your tribe saying no, you're outcast by the tribe. So you do become weird. So the only people who can say no, and a lot of the people watching this, will be outcasts. You'll be considered weird, you'll be considered eccentric, because you know in the core of your being, only dead fish go with the flow. So if you're going to say no, you're a weirdo. Can you live with being a weirdo? Now, many people watching this, they go, yeah, I've lived my whole life as a weirdo, it's no big deal. The majority of your humans around you are terrified of trying to live in that paradigm. They can't do it. For you, it's okay, you've always done it. They can't, which is why when you try and have these kinds of discussions with your family, your friends, your tribe, the people around you, they'll get really angry with you. They'll become aggressive because this is the way they've been trained to think.
Ted, after you committed your first murder, what was the emotional effect on you? What happened in the days after that?
It was like coming out of some kind of horrible trance or dream. I can only liken it to after, I don't want to over dramatize it, but to have been possessed by something so awful and so alien, and then the next morning wake up from it, remember what happened and realize that basically, in the eyes of the law, certainly in the eyes of God, you're responsible. To wake up in the morning and realize what I had done, and with a clear mind and all my essential moral and ethical feelings intact at that moment, absolutely horrified that I was capable of doing something like that.
You really hadn't known that before?
Basically, I was a normal person.
It's a strange world we live in. All we want is loving, searching for things unspoken. We can't hold this together.